What happens when we die? It's an almost cosmically horrific question to ask yourself, because there is no satisfying answer. Aside from the cold and unnerving truth that our bodies decay, we don't know. Cultures and civilizations throughout history have been hypothesizing since before we even had written language to document the question. Our society fears death so fiercely, always has. It's scary and big and inevitable, and no one wants to talk about it. I can almost guarantee you that half the people who clicked on this thumbnail have already clicked away again. Because it's a lot. It's a big topic. And understandably, to a lot of people, death is a major anxiety and reminds them that there's so much left to do and it's not their time yet. And what happens to our memories when we pass? And will we be remembered? And to that I say, I have a video game for you. This is how Night in the Woods helped me confront death. Before we get into the video essay, I just wanted to jump in here and remind you to subscribe and like the video for more content like this every single month. It's free and really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much. Death is everywhere in video games. It's the most ubiquitous fail state in the medium. If we die, we start over. When our companion passes away, we've failed them. Ashley, please. We misjudged a jump, and now we see our character's gruesome demise. Then hit rewind, and we're taken back to the last checkpoint to try again. Do better this time, and don't die. Sure, we might lose experience points or some collectibles, but in general, the more we die in games, the less those deaths mean. Because for the most part, we can start over and pretend that never happened. And as someone who's not really a fan of the roguelike genre, I'm not complaining. One death erasing all my progress takes the steam out of a game for me most of the time. But making death feel impactful in a game is pretty tough. Inherently, video game deaths don't elicit much emotion aside from, come on, are you kidding? Death in video games has become unremarkable. At the end of the day, death becomes a minor penalty, an inconvenience or an abstracted idea that doesn't really mean much the more it happens. In a game like Elden Ring, a player's first few deaths can be extremely frustrating and might even put their foolish ambitions to rest. Hey, that's my line. The pressure is on to stay alive and not lose their stash of precious runes. But the more often the player dies, the less it really matters to them, because the consequences are less and less meaningful. They can almost always recover what was lost with a few minutes of grinding. So while at the start of a playthrough, a newcomer to FromSoft games will be a lot more methodical when approaching conflict, the further they dive into their time with the game, the more brazen their choices become. Even when games feature permadeath, the first couple of losses to our team punch us in the gut, but not too long after, we start to realize that these characters, more often than not, are just replaceable pawns on our chessboard. Mechanically speaking, a majority of video games have routinized death, and it's kind of lost its meaning a bit. There are very few games out there that really explore the idea of death as it relates to our everyday, and make us contemplate what it actually means. The mundane passing, the nondescript fading, the casual brutality of the world around us, and how death impacts those left behind. These are big themes and tough ones to tackle over a game's runtime. And of course, not every game has to be an introspective masterpiece. But when it's done right, it can be beautifully expressive and a deeply moving, thought-provoking contemplation. But to me, the game that did this the best was Night in the Woods is a really unique game in almost every facet of its identity. Because at first glance, I thought Night in the Woods was just another entry into the hyper-specific genre of furry bait point-and-click adventure games. What is it about, like, zoomorphic characters and murder mysteries, by the way? It's like a whole thing. But this game about a depressed dark blue cat who just dropped out of college really surprised me and made me reanalyze the way I think about death, which, looking at the art style, might sound like a gigantic leap in logic, but hear me out. Infinite Fall's 2017 Kickstarter darling makes many people's list of perfect cozy games to play while drinking a pumpkin spice latte in fall, and did we play the same game? Behind its comfy autumnal facade is a fairly brisk chill of matter-of-factness. The game is all about death, not just the death of this quaint middle-of-nowhere town at the hands of capitalism, but also real, actual death. Like, people die in this game, and how that can change people. Everything in Possum Springs is centered around death in one way or another. Basically, every diversion we can partake in over the course of the game's 12 days relates back to something or someone withering away out of our control. Even the time of year the game takes place in. After all, autumn is a season during which leaves die and crunch under our boots, reminding us that nothing lasts forever. Even May's journal is bookended by juvenile scribbles remembering loved ones who've passed. We're introduced to death pretty early on in the game as well. After their first band practice since May's return, the group of friends leave the Click Clack Diner and stumble across a severed arm. It's not played for laughs or even dramatic tension, really. It's just a fact. There's a severed arm. That happened. It's that blunt execution that runs through the game which really caught my attention. In most games, you'd be given a loud musical sting, a close-up, and reaction shots of all the characters. Violence in big, bold, capital letters. In Possum Springs, though, death is gruesome and unnerving, sure, but it's a part of the tapestry of life, even if people don't really want to talk about it too much. The game takes these moments of violence and death and downplays them almost, ironically having a more realistic and grounded effect than most games. Within the town's tapestry, though, are strands of the past weaving their way into people's everyday lives. It's the kind of environmental storytelling that still feels immediate and relevant to the world we're in with May, as opposed to other games focused around that concept where pieces of the past we're finding help us put together a jigsaw puzzle covered in centuries of dust. In Night in the Woods, the town's history and dead townsfolk still feel apropos to the current day plot. It reminded me that even after we die, most of us will in one way or another live on through the stories we leave behind and the memories we've made with our friends. And not necessarily as apparitions or in a spiritual afterlife sort of way. Maybe we won't be there to look over our granddaughter as she sleeps until 3 in the afternoon, but we might live on in the stories people tell each other while looking up at the stars together. Growing up, we didn't really talk about death very much in my family. When a distant cousin or aunt passed away, my parents would mention it in passing and continue getting ready for work. Definitely a very healthy way to deal with emotions, right? And being the impressionable kid I was, I learned to do the same thing. Feeling an emotion? Well, keep it to yourself. That is, until my grandfather passed away when I was 13. I'd go back with my parents to see my Oma and Opa every summer and every other winter break when I was a kid. They had this big garden back in Germany where they'd grow rhubarb and kohlrabi and gooseberries and plums that they'd make into jams for the winter. And I was really looking forward to making some of those thumbprint cookies with that sticky jam that Christmas break. My mother was driving me home from school one afternoon in December, towards the end of the semester, when she muttered the news under her breath. In passing, like it was about the weather. Our plans that winter were canceled. Everything just kind of stopped for a second. I remember I didn't cry. I didn't really even acknowledge it. I didn't know how. And when we got home, I just went back to my room and finished The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess in one fell swoop. I didn't go to my Oppa's funeral, and neither did my mother. We couldn't really look death in the eye. It was too close and too real. Now that I'm an adult, I think I've gotten a much more well-rounded view of the world. I've learned to step away from my computer and experience life a bit more, but I think at the end of the day, video games as a medium, like I always say, are a great tool for empathy and for learning about yourself. Well-written games can really give you permission to be a little bit more meditative, introspective, in a world where things move so fast and where we're taught to just brush off the hard stuff. Don't be like my family. Don't be afraid to look the hard stuff in the eyes. To someone who hasn't really engaged with it much, Night in the Woods probably just looks like another cozy game about anthropomorphic animals and chill vibes, but Possum Springs is chock full of people trying to confront death, and mostly failing. The townies are all examples of what happens when you bottle up how you're really feeling. Bea hasn't really made time to mourn the loss of her mother and would much rather bury herself in the family business. After that severed arm is discovered in broad daylight, it's rarely talked about. And even the cave-in that ends the lives of dozens of the town's citizens is just referred to as an interesting occurrence. Despite the town's deep roots in its past, it's scared to death of death. But I think May is actually the one who teaches this town that death doesn't have to be so scary, even if she doesn't consciously know she's doing that. She unintentionally ignites a lot of fires that start illuminating people's problems a bit. She's not a main character because she was chosen or because she's a great hero. In fact, she's kind of a shitty person. She's the main character because everyone who she touched grew from knowing her. And I think she taught me a lot when it came to her perspective on living. Most of Possum Springs see her as a failure for dropping out of college and moving back home, but she's making the decisions that are best for her in spite of what society might think of her, living her life to the fullest, even if that means moving back home. Because as the game reminds us so many times over, life could be cut short at any moment without warning. May's coma, the town's sinkholes, and a flood the town had just been through before the events of the game serve as dramatic reminders that we might not be prepared for death when it comes knocking. The world has moved before us, and it'll keep moving after us. The game makes us feel insignificant, like how May feels coming back to a town full of people asking what she'll do with the rest of her life now that she's disrupted the flow of her future. What people see as the norm. That feeling of insignificance is one of the pillars of effective cosmic horror because we all fear how little we might matter in the grand scheme of things. And a big reason that the seemingly out-of-place introduction of the eldritch horror creatures isn't really so out of place after all. It's thematically at home in this world. Achieving the aesthetic of eldritch or cosmic horror is pretty simple. Make things dark and moody, slap a tentacle on it, and there you go. Vibes, baby. But the real meat of the genre, what makes Lovecraft-inspired horror work, is the very real-life dread the genre makes us confront. The fact that we don't matter, and the idea that beyond our perception of space and time, there are endless possibilities that we can't even begin to imagine. When you really sit with that, it's more unnerving than any monster could ever be. The otherworldly creatures are just a symptom of us interacting with a realm beyond our comprehension. And yeah, Night in the Woods isn't a horror game by any stretch of the imagination, but it borrows from a lot of the tropes of eldritch horror and has us confront similar ideas in a much more immediate and realistic scope. Back when it came out, a lot of the critique around Night in the Woods brings up the game's lack of interactivity as a negative. some reviews stating it made them feel disconnected from the story, not in control. And maybe I'm giving the devs a little bit too much credit here, but I'd go ahead and say this is actually one of the game's biggest strengths, because it actually plays into one of the game's bigger themes. We are insignificant, and life is out of our control. In a medium where a certain amount of control and choice are the norm, the lack of them almost has to be a deliberate statement. Even in straightforward narrative adventure games, there's usually a fair bit of player expression, that being in meaningful dialogue options or maybe failing a QTE during a climactic scene. But in Night in the Woods, no matter what you do, the outcome will always be the same. In a lot of other games where death became a mild penalty over the decades, this game that doesn't even feature a fail state became one of the most realistic depictions of how impactful death can be. Death is an incredibly personal experience, and losing a loved one will never compare to anything a video game could possibly present to you as a player. It's messy and unexpected, and you'll never really get the closure you want. And that's another big strength of Night in the Woods for me. It's lack of closure. Sure, there's a final band practice to tie back to the beginning of the game, but you're never really given answers to the biggest questions that the game asks. What exactly happened to Casey? Which townsfolk were part of the mysterious cult? Were May's eldritch visions reality? Or were they just cooked up by her inner psyche? But life doesn't always give us neat, tidy story arcs. Conclusions and closure are hard to come by, and the game wouldn't have been as resonant with so many fans had it directly answered the player's questions. In a lot of ways, the way the game plays out can be a metaphor for how we handle death, or really any loss in our life. Because it attacks the concept of how we deal with death from so many angles, I think Night in the Woods is one of the most complete explorations of death in gaming and possibly media. With its admittedly twee exterior, while dealing with pretty raw depictions of how unexpected the events of our life can be, it's a pretty chilling reminder that the only thing we can expect in life is death. In the space of the cosmos, our lives are so tiny and so short. So do our little hangups and setbacks even matter, or do they only have as much weight as we assign to them? The insignificance of our monstrous existence can really be comforting, actually. So even if we don't live the most extraordinarily interesting lives or finish our time at college, we can still lead fulfilling lives while we're here. And that's fairly heartwarming. So maybe this game all about death and insignificance and cosmic horror actually is cozy? It's presented the idea of death and nihilistic optimism in a much more approachable way for a lot of people. It made the concept of death accessible. And that's pretty huge. We're all just shapes, but we get to decide the way those shapes move throughout our lifetime before they vanish into the night sky. So enjoy stuff. Do what you love. Be good to people, because life isn't fair. You don't get to go back to your last checkpoint. And you never know when a sinkhole or a creepy cultist redneck dude lurking in the shadows is gonna get you. So hey there, thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to click the like button down below and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the video reach more people. And since I put over 40 plus hours into these videos every single month, it would mean the world. And speaking of helping out, these videos aren't cheap to produce. So if you believe in the content and want to see me do this full time, go over to my Ko-fi page and become a supporter if you'd like. It's kind of like Patreon, but way better. And speaking of that, a huge thank you to all my wonderful monthly supporters over on that Ko-fi page. Nightmare God, Undies Marita, Voxamandius, Puzzled Monkey Tree, Mumpow, Oyster Milk, Dear Papaya, Veltwalker, Cap Danvers, Robertson, A Werewolf, Fiend Fiello, Max Wattage, and Jar Draws Pixels. For as little as $4 a month, you can also become a monthly supporter over on Ko-fi to get shoutouts at the end here, extra content throughout the month, and sneak peeks at future video essays. Also, if you ever want to check out any of the games I mentioned in any of my video essays, there's always links to them down in the description, which help the channel and trans charities at the same time at no extra cost to you. Plus, they sometimes have sales that Steam doesn't even have, so it's worth checking out. Anyway, thank you again for watching the video. It means the world. Thank you so much. And oh yeah, go share the video.